Human communications. What are the benefits of communication? Making friends, informing and persuading others, solving, falling in and out of love, making your personal and professional relationships work, interpersonal, small group, organizational, and public communication skills are not inborn. You weren't. You have to develop them. This is the process that you will develop throughout your entire life. Now, who is a communicator? A communicator is anyone who enters into relationships with other people. Without communication, we would be unable to function. What is communication? Communication is the deliberate or accidental transfer or sharing of meaning. Communication is dynamic, meaning that all elements constantly interact with and affect each other. And communication is unrepeatable and irreversible. We cannot take back spoken words nor erase the effects of something we've done. Now, your book gives the definition of communication as the process by which we use signs, symbols, and behaviors to exchange information and create meaning. Sharing of meaning. All right, so we use models to as a formal description of the communication process. And your book talks about three models. But before we actually go into the models, we're going to talk about the actual elements that make up the communication process. The first is the source or the speaker, which is the originator of the thought or an idea. Okay. Now, I'm going to tell you this now. And as I said, communication is dynamic, meaning it's continuous, ongoing. So, in theory, there really is, we don't know exactly where the starting place is or not because when something is a circle, it's circular, it doesn't stop. It's continuous. It goes on and on and on. So at some point, that speaker becomes the listener becomes the speaker. So that's why, in theory, there really is no beginning or ending of the communication process. However, I mean, in practicality, but for us to actually show you and explain it to you, we start, we have to start somewhere. So we start with the source or the speaker. That speaker has an idea or a thought, but remember that idea must justify both speaking and listening. Because you know how sometimes we say some things are best left unsaid. You know, everything that you think you shouldn't say. So the speaker or source has an idea. That's the first element. But that idea needs to justify both speaking and listening. Then that idea is uh, transmitted, or it's actually first encoded, okay, into some type of language or gesture or behavior by the speaker, and it is transmitted as a message, which can be verbal or nonverbal. Um, and it's where we actually get our meaning. Now, this message then travels to a channel, or sometimes it's also referred to as a medium, which is basically the pathway through which the messages are conveyed, how the message travels. Number five of the elements of communication is the receiver or the listener. That's the person who interprets the message. Okay? They actually decode or interpret what the speaker said and give it some type of meaning. All right? And then we have noise, which is anything that distracts or interferes from the listener to actually receive the message that they want to hear or listen to, rather. Okay. Now, number eight and number nine is not found in every communication model. Number eight is feedback or response. Now, your response can be immediate or delayed. Responses are either verbal, meaning words, or nonverbal, something other than words, some behavior other than words. Okay. Immediate is when it occurs at the time of the speech. Delayed is when it occurs long after the speech. So an example of that might be if you gave a speech and the audience started clapping. Okay, that is a immediate response, feedback that happens at the time of the speech. They may look at you, or your audience may look at you and nod their head and agree. All of these actions that are occurring, responses that are recurring or that are occurring at the time of the speech is what we call immediate response. Then we have delayed response, which occurs long after the speech. And this is anything, any type of action that happens afterwards or even thought. So, for example, maybe you gave a speech on persuading people to vote and to register to vote, the importance of registration to vote. And later on, someone actually took you up on your persuasive idea or message to vote, and they went out and they registered and they actually voted. That will be an instance of a delayed response. And then number nine of the elements of communication is context, and that's actually the physical or psychological environment in which the communication occurs. Now, your book gives three models of communication: action model, interaction model, and transaction model. Okay, the action model describes the communication process as a one-way process, and it only uses the first seven elements of communication, meaning they don't consider the listener's feedback or response at all, and they don't consider the environment or situation in which the communication process is occurring. The second of the three types of models for communication process that your book talks about is the interaction model. Now, that describes the communication process by adding in the feedback and the context. Now, the interaction model differs from the action model in two ways. The first way is that it is a two-way process. Okay, remember the interaction process was just one way. It only talks about the speaker sending a message. Also, the interaction model adds the last two elements of feedback and context. Number three is transaction model. Okay. And the transaction model describes the communication process where everyone is simultaneously a sender and a receiver at all times. Now, the transaction model differs from the interaction model in two ways. It maintains that both people in the conversation are simultaneously sources and receivers, and it shows that the conversation flows in both directions at the same time. But in the end, an effective communicator takes the useful ideas each model offers and they fit these models into certain situations that can be more useful in some situations than in others. Now we want to talk about five axioms of communication. Okay, the first one is that communication messages are intentional and unintentional. Okay, remember earlier we talked about communication being deliberate, meaning you meant to do it, or accidental. So you cannot not communicate. We can never voluntarily stop behaving because behavior has no opposite. Now, there's four basic strategies we use for trying not to communicate. The first one is rejection. Okay, this is communication that rejects communication efforts. We do this by letting the other person know that we are not interested in conversing. However, we do not avoid communication this way, and we only succeed in creating strained, embarrassing, and socially uncomfortable situations. The second of the four basic strategies for trying not to communicate is acceptance. So you could either reject someone or you can accept someone. This is willingness to receive and respond to a message. The law of least effort. We do this by giving in reluctantly and agreeing to make conversation in the hope that the person will just go away quickly. Okay, you know how sometimes you say, okay, 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 thanks, all right, okay, thanks, bye, see you. Okay, this is acceptance. Okay, when we're trying not to communicate. So we can either outright reject you, or we can accept you, but we really are trying not to communicate with you. So we can reject, we can accept when we're trying not to communicate, and then thirdly, we can disqualify or disqualification is when communication it, it that invalidates a message. Now we do this when we communicate in a way that invalidates our own messages or the messages sent to us by the other person. For example, contradicting ourselves or switching subjects or uttering incomplete sentences in the hope that the other person will give up. The phrase, I don't care, in an argument is a classic example. How many times have you said whatever in an argument where you just gave up? You don't really agree with them, so you say whatever. All right, so we learned when we're trying not to communicate, we can reject, we can accept, kind of, we can disqualify, and then finally, the fourth of the four basic strategies for trying not to communicate is the symptom of communication. And this is merely just using an excuse as a reason for not wanting to communicate. Now, we do this when we pretend we like to talk to you, but because we're tired, nervous, sick, drunk, bereaved, deaf, or otherwise incapacitated, we simply cannot communicate at the moment. So we're actually using some symptom as a form of communication. Now, number one was that we cannot not communicate. Number two is every interaction has a content dimension and a relationship dimension. Now, that content level of your communication interaction is basically the information or the data level. And this is where you describe behavior expected as a response. So that's the content level is the information level in a communication interaction. The relationship level, however, indicates how the exchange is to be interpreted. Okay, it signals what one person thinks of another. The relationship level. So you always have these two levels when a communication interaction happens. One is the actual information, and then the other one is how the exchange is interpreted. Now, there's actually three types of responses that we use to indicate our reactions to other people. The first one is confirmation. Okay, confirmation is acknowledging and accepting another person and his or her self view. Now, we do this when we confirm other people's self definitions or self concepts and thus treat others as they believe they ought to be treated. I accept you as you are. Okay? In an argument, okay, a type of response of confirmation might be a person's telling you a situation of what happened and they may be upset, and then you say the listener responds and says, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. That's confirmation as a response. Okay? You can also respond to someone with rejection. Okay, confirmation that rejects another person's self concept. Now, we do this when we refuse to accept their beliefs about themselves. I do not accept you as you see yourself. Your self assessment is wrong. So, in an example, in a discussion, if someone's telling you, you know, I'm very upset about this. So the behavior that was displayed hurt my feelings, and I don't think that was correct. And then the response is, no, I didn't. I didn't hurt your feelings. That's rejection. That's a response of rejection. And you have to know when you are communicating with someone, what type of response are you giving? Because even though you might not say the word specifically, you still can send acceptance or rejection messages to people. Okay? For example, if someone, an acceptance, a rejection might be you're talking to someone, okay, and you're getting really heated when you're talking because you're reliving that moment, and your voice starts rising higher and higher, and your pitch gets higher, and you start becoming demonstrative, and the listener then responds to you and says, in the heat of you really being passionate about this communication message that you're trying to deliver, and the person says to you, calm down right now, like I can't hear that. Okay, now the person who is giving that is receiving that rejection. Okay, even though you didn't say you're wrong, the words you're wrong, you sent a message of rejection to that individual at that time, because when that person got your feedback, what they interpreted, because remember, when you get the information, you then decode it. When you get those words, you decode the meaning. And the meaning comes from actually the words that are said as well as the person saying it and thoughts behind it. Okay. So then that person who is receiving that rejection hears you saying calm down, meaning they may take it as they don't accept your view of what's going on, what you're saying. But you might not really be saying that. But then again, you may be saying that. So we have have to be careful about how we send the messages that we're trying to convey. Are you accepting this person or are you rejecting it? How are you saying it? Because the way your relationship level is very important and works alongside with the content, the information, the words that you're using, that verbal message that you're saying. So we have confirmation when we're responding, we have rejection when we're responding, and thirdly, we have disconfirmation. Okay? Now, disconfirmation is communication that shows a lack of interest in another person. Now, we do this when we imply that we do not care enough to let other people know how we feel and that we always treat people the same way no matter what they say or do. For example, we do not offer people any clues whatsoever to indicate that we believe they are or are not performing well or totally ignore them. Okay? You do not exist. You are a non entity. Okay? This is one of my favorite types of responses when I'm mad at my husband. I just confirm him. I don't say anything. I act as though he's not even there. It drives them crazy. People don't like this confirmation. So when you use it, you better be mindful of some of the consequences that come with it when you're trying to communicate. It could backfire on you too. So be mindful. When we respond to people, we can either confirm, reject, or disconfirm. And disconfirm is just totally ignoring the person, not responding to them at all. That's a strong message. I don't even care enough to talk to you. Number three of the five axioms of communication is that every interaction is defined by how it is punctuated. Now, communication has no clear, distinguishable starting point or ending point. As I've said to you before, communication is dynamic, meaning it's circular, continuous, and it's an ongoing series of events. So, what is stimulus for one is response for another. And this goes on and on. So the conversation ends or the communication effort ends. Number four of the five axioms of communication is that messages consist of verbal symbols and nonverbal cues. So these two types of messages are either one, digital, okay, that is the scientific term, which basically stands for verbal symbols or words. Words are verbal symbols, okay, they represent things. And we're going to find out when we talk about language that the only relationship between the words we use, okay, and the things that they represent are what's in people's thoughts and heads. What's your intent when you said that? Because words, that's how why sometimes people don't accept apologies because though you may have said the words, but the person receiving it does not think the thought that your thought behind it or your intention behind it is meaningful. Okay, so digital, verbal, that's the words. That's one way messages consist. And they also consist of the analogic system or nonverbal cues. These are cues that may contain sound, but no words. Whatever you're doing. Now, there's a content level of a message we talked about before that usually is more likely to be communicated through the digital system. So when you're giving information, you basically are using words. So full symbols or words when you're giving information. But the relationship level of a message is more likely carried through the analogic, how you're behaving, those nonverbal cues that you're giving off with no words. Number five is that interactions are either symmetrical or complementary. Two categories of communication interactions. Number one is symmetrical, and that's when the relationship, that's a relationship in where the behavior of one person mirrors the behavior of another person, or they are complementary, okay, where communication in which participants engage in opposite behavior, where one person's behavior serves to elicit the other person's behavior, or vice versa. That's complementary. The key to success is communication. Remember, we said communicate. Who a communicator is anyone who wants to enter into a relationship. Now, I wanted to go back to those models that we talked about, and I want to show you what they look like. So remember that first model we talked about, the action model. Okay, it has the source, the encode, the message, the channel or medium, um, but it doesn't have those last two. Okay, it has the receiver, they decode the message, but they don't. After the receiver gets the message, it stops there. It doesn't consider the response or the context or environment that the communication process is occurring in. Okay, and then the transaction model, you see, well, here you see that one way is just going one way. That's the one way action model. The transaction model, you see, it's going two ways. Okay, so the source has that idea, the message going traveling through the air to the receiver. It has some type of response, and then that response goes back to the receiver. And they interpret the message, and then they send the response back. And transaction adds feedback and context. Those last two um, of the nine elements of the communication process. And then finally, we have that transaction model where everything is occurring at the same time. Both the listener and the speaker is both the listener and the speaker at the same time. It's going back and forth with each word say. There's some type of interpretation and then there's some type of decoding. That's what this model describes. However, the model that I like to use and the model that I want to see on your exam is this one that shows communication as a dynamic process, as you see here. It's a circle, continuous. Okay, and we start here with the source. Okay, that source begins the communication process. That source or speaker has an idea, and that idea must justify both listening and speaking. The idea is then transmitted as a message, which the message is basically the words that you use, sounds, gestures, behaviors, all of that becomes the message to present the idea the speaker had. That message then travels through a medium or channel. Okay, that's how the message travels. It's usually the air through which the sounds and sight travel. Okay? Then that message travels again through that medium. Okay? Now this is connecting the source with the receiver. Here's the receiver or the listener. This is your audience. Okay? And they are going to now process or decode that message to consider the idea and give it meaning, interpret it and give it the meaning, hopefully, that the speaker intended for him or her to have. That receiver, after decoding, then sends a response that's either immediate or delayed. Immediate response is something that happens during the speech. And the delayed response is what happens as a result of the speech, after the speech. Okay? And then that response then is returned back to the source or speaker who can hopefully in the speech adapt the presentation. So it might be a question that the speaker asks. Now the speaker then is going to interpret again and send that message back out to the receiver. And it's a continuous process until it actually breaks and one or the other person indicates that the communication effort is over. And the whole thing takes place in what we call a communication environment. And you see that has a dotted line here. Okay. And we can sometimes have what we call noise or interference, and it looks like that. That's how it's represented. Jagged line through the whole thing, interfering, distracting us from getting the message that we like to receive. And that's your communication process. That concludes the end of lecture one.